Today's webinar is sponsored by Intilaris Life Sciences. Intilaris is a Swiss-based clinical development consulting company and is extremely pleased to be able to sponsor this presentation today by Ken Getz.
Our endpoints, if we look at those two different time horizons, have seen growth primarily in one area, and that's in the area of the supporting and tertiary and miscellaneous or exploratory endpoints. The typical protocol still has one, possibly two primary endpoints and several key secondary endpoints, but all of that additional endpoint creep and increase in scope is coming in that other area, the supporting and the tertiary and exploratory area. There are many reasons why we see wide expansion in the scope of our protocols. We collect a lot of data to obviously address our critical objectives in the study, our essential objectives, but we also collect a lot of data to provide context to interpret the results of our studies. Some of this is out of habit and most of it tied to our protocol authoring practices, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. One habit, for example, the cutting and pasting of a phase 2 protocol into the planning of a protocol designed for a phase 3 study. Some of it is due to anticipated challenges or questions or inquiries from regulatory agencies or health authorities. And so there's a risk mitigation, risk management driver that increases our scope. And we see many new areas that are increasing scope as well, including the collection of more outcome measures, trying to gather more data that helps understand the economic benefit or the comparative effectiveness of a particular drug relative to a comparator like a standard of care. We see more studies that now have or include companion diagnostics, and we are collecting much more biomarker data in all of our studies. And all of this contributes to additional endpoints and the collection of more data. Not only is the scientific complexity of our programs increasing, our projects increasing, but we can also look individually at protocols across different phases, and we see that the increases really are not phase agnostic. Our phase 2 and our phase 3 studies are places where we see the most rapid growth, or the most substantial growth in complexity, as measured here by the number of distinct or total procedures that are performed. That total procedure grouping really covers the total number of distinct procedures times their frequency. And you can see, for example, that phase 2 and 3 total procedures have grown at a higher rate than has the distinct procedures. And that's in part because we are conducting all of our procedures more frequently now than we did in that prior time period. A couple of other very interesting measures. On the left-hand side, you see a measure that we designed working with Medidata Solutions to articulate the work effort involved in administering each individual procedure. And this is tied to, and it's an adaptation of the Medicare relative value unit methodology that was designed to determine reimbursement rates. It takes into account the individual conducting the procedure and the amount of time that that procedure takes, and we've essentially mapped those relative value units across to clinical trial procedures. On the right-hand side, you see the average direct total procedure cost per patient per visit. And this has grown considerably, even when we adjust for inflation. We're looking at real dollars. In phase 2, we still see a strong increase. Phase 3, a more modest increase. What's important here is to think about two counter trends and one that's winning out. We know that over time, the cost of certain procedures, the price of certain procedures, I should say, like an ECG assessment, an X-ray, or perhaps imaging, many of these procedure costs taken individually are actually declining over time. But conducting these procedures more frequently, and when we add up the cost of all of the other procedures that we're conducting and the decline in the price for an individual procedure is not enough to offset the impact of complexity overall per patient per visit. Here are some other operating measures that now look beyond even just the science, broken out by phase, the work effort units, as well as the cost per procedure. We can look at some of the logistical and operating complexity measures, like the number of countries, the number of investigative sites. These have all increased, with the exception of the number of study volunteers, which has actually declined on average per protocol, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. The operating complexity is very, very strong and pronounced. We hear from many organizations that the challenge of distributing clinical trial medicine kits or collecting lab data, monitoring investigative sites dispersed globally, the interactions with multiple health authorities and regulatory agencies, and dealing with some of the challenges of shipping supplies to various parts of the world. All of these logistical challenges add another layer of complexity that has to be managed. Interestingly, the number of investigative sites has increased while the average number of study volunteers per protocol has declined. And this is in part a function of organizations looking to spread recruitment risk across a larger number of sites at the same time that the average clinical trial is getting smaller as we target more rare diseases and or more targeted stratified diseases. So that is where we'll conclude the discussion about practices, design practices. Let's now look at how these practices impact performance. And we don't have to look very far. Essentially, protocol complexity is correlated with poor performance. The more complex the protocol, the worse the performance. We can look at patient recruitment and retention rates, for example, and what we found in a study that we conducted in 2013, those protocols that were in the top tertile of complexity were associated with significantly longer cycle times, but not at the beginning of the trial. They had only modestly longer cycle times from protocol readiness to first patient, first visit. But it was the downstream impact of a complex protocol and the demands that were placed on our study volunteers that resulted in a substantially longer and significantly longer cycle time when we look at the full cycle from protocol readiness to last patient, last visit. There are many other studies published in the literature that touch on this, this very strong correlation. More complex designs, for example, are associated with lower levels of physician referral and physician participation rates. A study by Anderson conducted in 2009 found that volunteer dropout rates were associated with complex protocol designs. Not hard to see how this could happen given the demands that we place on our volunteers. We make it even more difficult for them to qualify for our studies, and once they're in them, we are now asking them to participate in ever more demanding series of procedures performed during each visit. Our recruitment timelines overall are much longer than they used to be relative to plan. And this, in many ways, it is explained in part by the chart I showed earlier. On the left-hand side, we see a reported increase in duration over planned enrollment timelines. And we see across every therapeutic area, the typical planned duration has to be doubled in order to actually recruit the requisite number of volunteers. So our actual timelines are nearly double the planned timeline. Some of that may be a function of setting ever more aggressive timelines, and it also reflects the competitive intensity that many investigative sites face as they search for patients for many of their studies. On the right-hand side, we see the typical enrollment achievement pattern for a global multi-center study, a phase 3 study. And this is a pattern we see time and time again. Even after we double the planned duration, we still typically see about 10% of sites that will fail to enroll a single patient. And about 40% of sites will under-enroll. This is a very costly segment because they've been activated. They have to be monitored, and these sites have to be managed. And so this particular group is of great challenge for industry to manage. And a lot of this is due to the feasibility, executional feasibility challenges posed by our protocol design.